All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for joining us for Data Centers 101, Data Centers and Energy Costs. We're really excited to tackle the topic of energy costs today. I am Dr. Natasha D. Jarnett of the Christina Lee Brown Environment Institute at University of Louisville. And here in our institute, I lead community engagement and serve in the research teams of Green Heart Louisville and our Superfund Research Center. I am grateful to acknowledge our colleagues that are a part of the planning of this series, Doctors Candy Walker and Joy Hart, who lead community engagement in Green Heart Louisville, and Doctors Ted Smith and Lauren Hepperly, who lead the community engagement core of the Superfund Research Center. So this series is hosted by the Christina Lee Brown Environment Institute, and it's for a program that's called The Exchange, which brings together the community engagement initiatives of both Green Heart Louisville and the U of L Superfund Research Center. And we also want to thank Physicians for Social Responsibility for being a sponsor of the series. As we get started, I will note that the opinions expressed by the presenters are that of their own and do not necessarily represent the views of University of Louisville or the Christina Lee Brown Environment Institute, nor that the use of logos therein indicate endorsement. So if you are a repeat attendee by now, you are very familiar with the goals of this series, that we want to have shared knowledge and we want to have an exchange of dialogue around a really complex topic. And hopefully you're capturing some of that complexity where we have looked at health and economics and the environment and communities, and today energy costs, and notice that it's the dialogue is very widespread. Of course, we want to continue to connect people to resources. We have our culminating event next week, and after that, we are excited that we will be sharing out the repository of resources that you have been sharing that we've been finding elsewhere. So please continue to share those resources here in the chat. We've been asked each week, and we've seen it on the evaluations where people are saying, we want to see the slides from the presenters so that you can continue to learn. And our presenter today has graciously accepted that opportunity to share slides. So we'll get those to you as soon as we can after this webinar. But understanding that there are multiple viewpoints. So please continue to be respectful of each other. The chat is almost as exciting as the content of the meeting. So continue to raise questions in the chat, continue to help answer other people's questions in the chat, and share what's going on within your communities. Our first opportunity to hear a little bit more from you is in the Menti poll. So we've got another Menti poll today where you can participate and be a part of the conversation. You can scan the QR code that's on the screen here. You can also go to menti.com and type in the code 39630467. Again, that's 39630467. I'm going to go ahead and load up the Menti. Another QR code will appear on the screen, and you're able to use that to join the Menti as well. Let me exit here. Minimize, and here we are in our Menti poll. All right, so there's our QR code. You're already here. This is wonderful. How many webinars have you attended or watched so far? If your answer is 0, that means today is your first webinar, and welcome. And this includes those that you have attended live or those that you have watched in our list of recordings. And we'll be happy to share a list of recordings too. If you've attended 1, if you've attended 2, if you've attended 3 before, all the way up to if you've attended all 6 leading into today, we are so grateful. This is exciting. We've got a lot of first-time attendees today. So thank you, thank you, thank you for joining. Looks like almost everyone has responded. Thank you. You'll still be able to respond to this question. I am going to move us forward to our next question, but thank you so much to our new attendees and to our repeat visitors. So, what is one word that comes to mind when you think of the energy costs associated with data centers? This is our topic for today's discussion, energy costs. So, would love to know what is one word that you think of? We've got utility bills, got high costs, exorbitant costs, humongous, high, unaffordable, escalating, disproportionate costs, environment, yes. Poor pay, rich benefit, skyrocketing utility bills, pay more. Waste. I see necessary, noise, environment. All right. I appreciate a good word cloud. It kind of pulls all the thoughts into one. It's sobering. Wow. More disparities, unfair increases, unfair costs. Okay, great. Thank you for adding these in. The words that are largest are those words that are coming in most frequently. Affordability, unaffordable, high. Uh, well, thank you so much for participating. I'm going to hop on to our next question. Don't hesitate to continue to add to that. We'll certainly check it out afterwards. All right, so we have another sliding scale option here. To what extent do you believe a local hyperscale data center will impact energy costs? Do you believe that it will have no impact all the way up to a lot of impact? You can select between 1 and 5 as it pertains to household energy costs, to local energy costs, or to national energy costs. Let's see. I'll give a moment before I start giving a synopsis. Let a few more people join into this. Right, nearly half of you, all right, just over half of you have responded. So thus far, when people think the most impact out of this list of options is for local energy costs. But it's almost spot on with household energy costs as well, but less so for national energy costs. Thanks for participating. It seems to be holding pretty steady right here. All right, thanks, folks. I will move us to our next question. Got about 3 questions left. And so this, based on your opinion, and you can select as many as apply. Actually, I believe you can only select up to 5. Who should bear the energy costs of data centers? The community, local and state government, federal government, data center developers, energy companies, high consuming industries, and that could include industries that use a lot of AI, and local utilities. Thus far, the majority are saying data center developers, as well as high consuming industries. I wouldn't call those quite neck and neck, but they're pretty close, certainly by comparison to the other potential groups. And absolutely 0 people that are responding thus far are saying the community. I would say we are surprised, but we are not surprised by this result. But we wanted to include all the possible and all the potential groups that have been discussed in terms of the cost of data centers or the energy costs of data centers. All right, looks like we're holding pretty steady. The majority are saying data center developers and high consuming energies, followed by energy companies, local utilities, and local and state government and federal government are ranking a bit lower. All right, thank you. Thank you for responding here. All right, putting you to work with some open-ended responses based on what you've learned so far through what is a data center health, through data centers and the environment, the economics of data centers and policy. Based on what you've learned so far, what is your greatest concern about data centers? And I think I neglected to say data centers and the environment. What is your greatest concern about data centers? So this is open-ended. You're able to add in. We'll give folks a moment here. The health effects on our population. Health impacts, environmental damage, resource exhaustion, consumer financial protection, interesting, increased costs, environmental impacts, water pollution, environmental damage, rising utility costs, affecting lifestyle, power in the hands of people with bad intent, loss of farmland for short-lived data center development, pollution, fossil fuel consumption, negative health impacts. Public misunderstanding causing us to lose a significant opportunity. Oh, very interesting. Health impact on the communities, water use, neighbors' negative impacts, how data centers can be, I would say, incorporated without impairing a community's quality of life. Yes. Pollution of various types, health, human health, environmental impacts, geographic concentration, increased cost of utilities. Very interesting. So far, these are the greatest concerns that you are sharing. And we certainly appreciate you taking time to share here. We have one more similarly spirited question based on what you have learned so far. What do you feel is the greatest opportunity of data centers? I know that there were a couple comments that we received that there could be missed opportunities here. So what are some of the greatest opportunities? Learning hard lessons, very interesting. Computing ability, yes, we did have learned quite a bit about that. Seems like a data center industrial complex, yes. Information sharing, yes. Public coming together and bonding against these data centers, improving productivity, access to knowledge, improved technology skills, all very interesting. Responsible innovation, keeping up with the world around us. Yes, that has come up a few times here. The use of AI in good ways that we couldn't before, reducing health disparities, improving disease prevention. Yes, yes. Nothing can be done locally and in computers now and in the future. Improve communications innovations. Data center development should be stopped. Services that the community needs to develop industry responsibly, information and computing access. Well, thank you all so much. I will keep this open. Feel free to continue to add to the survey. With that, we're really excited to turn to this week's short video. I have about a 3-minute video to share with you before we hear from our speaker. Again, my disclaimer, apologies if there's an ad that appears. We've done our best to prevent that. We'll go ahead and begin today's video.
Illinois, Virginia, Ohio, Texas, and California have the highest concentration of data centers in the U.S. Residents in those states have seen their electricity bills go up substantially this year.
If we look at Department of Energy data, on average, electricity prices have increased about 6% year over year from August of 2024 until August of 2025. The independent market monitor for PJM found that data centers are overwhelmingly responsible for the increase in capacity prices.
A data center campus running at the lower end of peak demand uses roughly the same amount of power as the population of San Francisco. Meanwhile, data center electricity demand is projected to rise 15 to 20% every year through 2030. That will get expensive for American residents.
PJM is the largest grid in the nation. It covers 13 states and 65 million people. PJM holds a capacity auction every year. It's basically an auction that secures power from power generators to ensure that that power is available if there's a particularly hot summer or a particularly cold winter. The auction that was held in 2022, the total amount that PJM was going to pay for capacity was $2.2 billion. In the following auction, it rose to $14 billion. That's more than a 500% increase. What this watchdog found was that 60% of that total cost could be attributed to current data centers and to forecast data center load. The reason why that matters is because capacity prices are passed on to consumers. Affordability and cost of living is obviously at the center of American politics right now. Trump campaigned on this in 2024. He promised to reduce electricity prices by 50% in his first year in office. That has not happened. There was a letter that was sent this week by a group of Democratic senators led by Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, basically accusing the administration of not doing enough to ensure that consumers are insulated from data centers' impact, and also basically accusing the White House of being too cozy with big tech. In the elections last week, affordability was obviously a major issue. Mikey Sherrill and Abigail Spanberger campaigned on this in the gubernatorial elections. They won in landslides. Sherrill has promised to declare a state of emergency on utility rates and to freeze prices. Abigail Spanberger has promised to make data centers pay their fair share.
Roughly 80 million Americans say they need to forego basic expenses like medicine and food to afford their utility bills. A CNBC analysis of federal data estimated that the average U.S. household annual electricity bill could reach $1,902 in 2025, up roughly $219 from 2022. But these increases in prices can't only be attributed to data centers.
Reshoring of manufacturing will drive that too. But a huge part of the growth in American energy is for exports to our allies in Europe and Asia around the world, and that's separate from AI.
Okay, thank you so much for watching the video. I am excited to introduce today's speaker. Karim Marshall is an attorney and nationally recognized expert on environmental justice, climate resilience, and energy strategy. He is the Director of Climate and Energy Policy at the Consumer Federation of America. Marshall brings nearly 2 decades of experience in environmental law, cross-sectoral partnership, development, and government leadership, including senior roles at the United States Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, and the Executive Office of the Mayor of Washington, D.C. He most recently served as senior advisor for the Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights Program at the U.S. EPA, and his work helped to strengthen adaptive responses to climate impacts and expand community-centered environmental protections nationwide. In his current role, Marshall leads the Consumer Federation of America's climate, energy, and environmental justice work through the lens of consumer protection, advancing policies to help lower consumer energy costs, expand equitable access to clean energy, and strengthen community resilience. So we are grateful for you to come and to share with us today. And in our first evaluation of the webinar, people said they want to understand energy costs, how the potential costs can affect them. And so we are so grateful that literally at the same time you were reaching out with an opportunity. If people want to hear about this, you have this information to share. So it could not have been more perfect. We are thankful to hear from you. I am going to stop sharing so that you're able to share, and we are really excited to learn from you today. Thank you so much, Kareem, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm gonna do a quick introduction and then start sharing my screen. So again, good afternoon, everyone. Specifically, thank you to Dr. Desjardins, Greenheart Louisville, the Christina Lee Brown Environment Institute, and the University of Louisville, and Physicians for Social Responsibility for hosting this conversation. I'm honored to be able to close out this series with a discussion on the impact of data centers on energy costs. Now, I know that the local community is dealing with specific siting issues, but I just want to note that many of the communities dealing with this may feel like they're sort of being overwhelmed by industry and they're dealing with this issue by themselves. And that's not true. You're not alone. There is a vast and expanding network of communities that are sharing advice, victories, and hard-earned lessons as they navigate this evolving area. But fundamentally, just like any issue around environmental siting or locally undesirable land uses, this remains an issue around who bears the burden of externalities and who fits the bill. All right, so I'm going to start my presentation and okay. Um, so So after we have to go back in time a little bit, I got to take you back to 1970s, early 1970s. After the oil shocks of the 1970s, specifically the 1973 embargo and the 1979 Iranian Revolution, global production actually dramatically increased. And simultaneously, energy markets in the United States were deregulated. So until about 10 years ago, we lived in an era of mostly cheap, but definitely abundant energy. Now there were some spikes, but for the most part, we spent a lot of time in the troughs. After a decade plus plateau, national electricity demand has actually risen 2.1% annually over the past 5 years, and it's projected to grow at an average annual rate of between 0.9 and 1.6% per year through 2050. And this is according to the current Department of this is the current Department of Energy's Energy Information Agency. So this is governmental, non-biased data, but if anything, it would have a potential bias towards minimizing the potential impact of data centers. So at a minimum, we can expect a zero point 0.9 increase year over year over the next 25 years. So this is going to be an incredibly compounded, it will be an incredibly serious increase in energy consumption. Now, we are currently in an era of high energy supply with higher demand, and it's concentrated in sectors and bursts. Technically, today there are more available electrons, sources of energy, than at any point in human history. If you analyze total energy use, it looks like a steadily trending upward consumption line with some seasonal variation, but current demand is different than prior increases. Specifically, data center load is emerging as the dominant driver of long-term U.S. electricity growth. Increase in efficiencies in home appliances and office equipment actually masks the increased demand of compute and storage. So a major and highly visible factor in that energy demand growth are large data centers, sometimes called hyperscalers. So this is colloquially called a spaghetti chart, and I'm sure you can guess why. It'll be available in the slides when I send it out. The Energy Information Agency publishes one of these every year. It shows where all the energy comes from that is consumed in the United States and to what sectors it flows. It uses a unit called British thermal units. Um, and the reason they use British thermal units is because liquid fuel versus solid fuel versus solar energy versus wind, it all comes through in slightly different concentrations in different ways. So you want to be able to compare energy consumed versus energy used versus energy produced. The only way to do that is to have a common point of comparison, and BTUs allow for that. Now, one of the things you'll notice here that are a little interesting is that most of our energy by BTU still comes from petroleum and natural gas. Renewables account for slightly more of the energy mix than coal, but this is a continuing trend and it's expected to continue through 2050. Renewables should increase, coal use should continue to decrease. And this is even accounting for the deprioritization of enhancing renewables of the current administration. Now, unfortunately, the growth of renewables is expected to slow. We probably won't see the degree of growth that we've seen over the last few years with renewables, or we won't see the speed of growth that we've seen over the last few years with renewables. But even without the federal government subsidizing it and underpinning the market, the projection is still that renewables will tend to increase to grow, particularly at utility scale. Nuclear is entirely used for electricity generation. I think one of the interesting things that's particularly useful about nuclear is that it provides something called base load, which we'll talk about when we start to talk about projections and bidding for available capacity. But nuclear is one of those fuel sources that is only used for one purpose. It is wholly used for base load. Now, this little black box here at the bottom, this is called an energy loss. This is energy that just either gets converted out when you are burning petroleum and turning it into electricity, when you're burning natural gas and turning it into electricity. When you guys get the slides, you'll see that the conversion of natural gas to electricity has a 40% loss. And that's just because in the act of burning natural gas, you're going to lose some of the British thermal heat units. You're going to lose some of the BTUs to heat energy. So being able to account for that loss is the way that we keep both sides of the equation balancing out. We do have to acknowledge that even though natural gas is energy dense, a good portion of that energy gets lost when you burn it. Same with coal and to a lesser degree, petroleum. Um, that black box is just wasted energy. And as we increase efficiency in transmission and distribution lines, that number shrinks. As we increase the efficiency of boilers, as we are burning fossil fuels, um, that number should continue to shrink, but it is a natural consequence of burning something in order to get energy that you're going to lose some of it to heat. And then it's also a consequence of transmitting power from the point of generation to the point of uses. You will actually lose power, just from load loss. So as we talk about hyperscalers, there's no universal definition of what constitutes a hyperscaler, but the consensus today, as of July 15th, 2026, is that a hyperscaler is a facility that uses 100 megawatts of power or more. I specifically say today, and I emphasize today, because the projected energy consumption for data centers is expected to at least triple between now and 2028. And the projections out to 2050 are even more impactful. So today's large could very well be tomorrow's small. So come with me. Over the next 25 to 30 years, we're going to talk about something that most of us take for granted, what it takes to keep the lights on, and how that's going to get more expensive in the near term. So how does this impact your bill? Because of my hosts, I'm trying to use a utility they may find familiar as an example. This is the detail section of an LGE combined gas and electric bill. A lot of utilities don't actually have combined gas and electric, but the ones that do actually give you a decent amount of information as far as seasonal use. You'll be able to see which fuel you're using more in the winter and which fuel you're using more in the summer. That's typically more electricity in the summer and more natural gas in the winter. So the detail section has both, but you'll notice that both the bills are not as straightforward. You've used X number of hours of electricity, so this is how we're going to charge you. It's broken out into subsections. There's an approved rate for the energy that you use. There's a rate for delivery. There's a baseline service charge. There's a fuel adjustment. And there are two non-usage fees, an environmental surcharge and a home energy assistance fund. Now, for our friends who may not necessarily be in this jurisdiction, understand that your utility bill will look different. As a policy matter, a lot of utilities have been directed by their local governments to add on surcharges that will either support low income residents, that will facilitate the subsidizing of the development of green energy, that are used for a preemptive identification of ways to help people in emergencies. So some of these charges are policy choices, but the component charges, the ones that have a multiplier attached to them, such as the energy charge and the electric DSM and the electric fuel adjustment, those are based off of market forces and usage. Your baseline electric charge is going to be the one that's the biggest number. That's how much electricity have you used. That is going to reflect the cost that it takes to produce the energy, purchase the energy on the open market, and the delivery charges will actually be separate from that. In some jurisdictions, they will break it into three components. Generation, which is the cost to actually produce the electricity. Transmission, which is what it costs to get power from the point of production, so a power plant, to a cluster. And a cluster can be a series of small farmhouses. It can be a large major city. It can be delivering it directly to an apartment building, which will then step the power down and deliver it to the homes specifically within the apartment building. And then distribution. For any of you who live in a suburb or a densely populated urban environment, distribution wires are typically the wires that you see that connect directly to a house. Those costs have both an associated fuel cost and a recovery of the infrastructure that was necessary to build that. So it's not just the price of the electrons that are streaming through the infrastructure. It's also how much did it cost to buy these wires, hang these wires, pay the people to hang the wires, to maintain the wires over time. So when you look at these costs, understand that there's a combination of you are paying for the electricity that you are currently using, but you are also paying for everything that it took for the electricity to be delivered to you over time. Now, all these prices are going to impact your bottom line, but the one that you will typically see being the most expensive and the one that is most susceptible to market influence from a new person or a new entity that is seeking demand on the grid is going to be the energy charge. Now, some jurisdictions will list this as generation fee or energy purchase, but it's essentially how much did your utility pay on the open market in order to buy to deliver the electrons to you at that moment. Another interesting wrinkle about this is that the United States, as a developed country, actually has an underdeveloped electricity storage capacity. Nearly all of the electricity that you are using right now is not being drawn from a battery, as it is in other countries. Nearly all of the electrons that you are consuming right now to power your phone, to keep your air conditioning going, to attend this webinar, all of those electrons are generally being generated right now. There is a power plant somewhere in your grid that is sending electricity through this network to get to your home or office and facilitate your ability to participate in any of these activities. It's important to also think about how the average consumer uses electricity. Most of it is cooling or heating. The vast majority of the energy consumption that individual households use is going to be either the air conditioner to keep their space cool. If they have electric heating, they'll more likely than not use it for heating or water heating. The increases in efficiency in consumer electronics over the last 20 years have vastly reduced the amount of energy that needs to be drawn from the grid in order to take your house's base load. Like this is the amount of energy that your house uses when you're not doing anything. Your refrigerator is cycling on and off. You have clocks plugged in that are drawing a small amount of power. Your computer, even if it's not being used at that moment, if it's still plugged in, it's pulling a little bit of power from the grid. The amount of base load that the average household consumes has drastically decreased over time. Not because people are using less energy, but because appliances have gotten a lot more efficient. So we as a technology driven society, we try to increase the efficiency of each of these tools that we use so that as we expand the number of devices that we have in our home, the utility usage in our homes doesn't increase exponentially. Now, as a residential customer, your usage is going to be measured in something called kilowatt hours. But when we talk about data centers, we're typically talking about megawatts. The conversion is difficult, and that's for a couple of reasons. Mainly because we don't intuitively think about energy use in terms of time. The analogy I use, and I hope you find it useful, is that 1 kilowatt hour is about the same as running a normal vacuum cleaner for about an hour. So think 1 kilowatt hour equals running my vacuum cleaner for a full hour. A normal 4-person household will use about 35 kilowatt hours per day. That scales up to about 13,000 kilowatt hours per year, which converts over to 13 megawatts metric system. 13, it's about 13 megawatts per year per household. So keep that number in your head, 13 megawatts per year per household of 4. A 100 megawatt data center, something that qualifies as a hyperscaler, is expected to run at near peak capacity continuously. So a 100 megawatt data center would use a comparable amount of power to 80,000 households per year. And that's where the differential comes in. A normal household of people is using power intermittently plus a base load. So when you get home from work or school, you're probably going to cut on a television or you're going to cut on music or you'll plug in your devices. So your usage will increase during those hours. Data centers, because they are constantly in use and are expected to constantly be available for use, are always nearly always operating at as close to peak capacity as they possibly can. So it's the difference between 80,000 homes that have slight upswings and swings in usage versus a cluster of 80,000 homes that's doing a continual draw. And that's the real differential between sort of consumer usage and data center usage. Um, so if you're in a regulated market, the state or local regulators actually allow the utilities to bake in profit. And this is a sort of natural function of the way that we've decided to regulate our utilities in this country. A reasonable rate of return is generally statutorily baked into the authorizing statutes for any of the public service commissions that oversee utilities. So a point of frustration that I've noticed is that in a lot of jurisdictions, the questions that people are asking are, well, why are these expenses that seem unrelated to delivering power to my home considered recoverable or allowable costs? And those are fair questions to ask. Being able to determine why certain costs are allowed or allowable and allowed to be included in what's recoverable is a fair question to ask. So it's perfectly reasonable for a person who's paying their electric bill to wonder why they're paying for bonuses or perks or things that don't necessarily contribute to infrastructure, but may contribute to like the morale of the people who work in the company that delivers infrastructure. So you'll see these types of questions occur pretty frequently where there's a degree of scrutinization over what's considered or what's applied to be recovered for by the utility. Now rates, they typically change in response to shifts in utility costs over time. Previously, this was an annual or a semi-annual change, but because of the challenges in supply, rates have been increasing a lot more frequently. Additionally, utilities are allowed to seek cost recovery if they have unanticipated additional demand, and they can spread that across the allowable rate base. So what has become previously an instance where if a utility invested in a new power plant or upgraded the grid, then the rates would be sort of baked in and they would need to change based off those capital investments and they would be amortized out over 25, 30, 50 years, whatever the expected life of that asset would be. And utility sales have a factor as well. If your utility is selling more power than it anticipated and it actually has access to that power, then they feasibly could offer you a rate reduction if they've been able to make more in sales than they anticipated. But in this current environment, because of the relative scarcity of available power, the degree to which utilities have had that extra power to make extra sales is limited. Okay, so I want to talk to you about energy markets, and I promise this is fun. So go with me. I'm going to show you a couple of slides. This is the grid. These are the independent system operators. This is infrastructure. These are markets. These are very similarly bordered, but they are not the same thing. When we talk about the grid, we are essentially talking about the Western grid, which covers the Pacific coast to the Rocky Mountain states, the rest of the country, and Texas, because Texas is special and Texas has its own grid. When you are looking at these sub-grid markets, these are the mechanisms by which we move power between markets. So you've got a Midwest market, everything around the Great Lakes, the Southeast, and New England. Texas exists as its own entity, and it's not even all of Texas. It's mostly just the central and southern part of Texas. but Texas is actually not capable of connecting with the Western or the Eastern grid. All of these four, MRO, SERC, RF, and MPCC, they are actually clumped together as the Eastern grid. Over time, we've gotten a lot better at creating interconnectivity within these submarkets in the Eastern grid because this is how we deal with excess capacity in one part of the country being shifted to another part of the country. Remember what I said about somewhere in this country, a power generating resource is creating the energy that's necessary for you to use whatever electronics you're using at this moment. Now, you could be here in SERC, but the generating asset that's sending power to you could be as far away as New England. Um, the way the market works, and this actually took me a minute to become really comfortable with to be able to explain, but the best way to think about it is it's a futures market. If you want to buy energy, just like the clip showed earlier, there is an auction every year that talks about capacity. Everyone who has a generating asset, be that a nuclear power plant, a coal-fired power plant, a natural gas plant, a solar farm, a wind farm, all of these folks go to their local market. If you are in PJM is the one that was mentioned in the news cycle. And it stands for Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, because PJM initially only covered those three states. Now it covers this entire area. It is the largest from a generating capacity, not from a geographical standpoint, but from a generating capacity standpoint, it is the largest source of electricity in the country. So their market is the one that people tend to look to get a hint of what the market nationally is going to do. But each of these independent system operators, these markets, do an auction at the start of the year and they say, I've got 42 terawatts of energy that I want to auction off, and you can buy access to that energy in advance. And in fact, that's what you want your utility to do. You want your utility to buy exactly what they need in advance in this market auction, because the alternative is to buy on the spot market. And purchasing on the spot market is incredibly expensive because you are buying at the mercy of whoever is selling at that moment. And if you were normally able to buy at a price of, say, 20, if the only person that's selling in the spot market is selling at 150, you either buy it or you have a controlled blackout. Um, if there's one thing that utilities and independent system operators are very wary of is anything that indicates that the grid is not reliable or there's not enough capacity on the grid. Now, here's where the data centers come in. There is an increase in demand at a time where capacity is not increasing at the rate that it had historically. This sort of merger of increased demand and aging supply is a really unfortunate factor because if generation capacity coming online had kept pace with the degree to which we were building new demand, people wouldn't actually be feeling the pinch quite as much. But because of aging infrastructure, failure to maintain, the very sensible decision to move away from more polluting sources of energy, we are now having fewer assets online while demand is increasing, which has created a situation where the wholesale spot electricity prices have spiked intensely. And you see the seasonal variation between the pricing, but what's most important is that this is still an average of month to month. So there are instances where you'll have 1 or 2 days in a month where the spot price is ridiculously high, like 20 or 30 times what the price should actually be. But again, the alternative for a utility is to either purchase on the spot price or do a controlled blackout. And nobody wants that. Now, why does that happen? There's a couple of things happening. Um, Mr. Moneybags here gives us an example. In a lot of ways, people who are actually building the hyperscale sensors are playing an interesting game of Monopoly. One of the factors that makes it a lot more difficult to project demand accurately is every time you build something that's going to try to connect to the grid, that's going to use a lot of power. You have to do something called an interconnection request. The interconnection requests go to each of the independent system operators separately. So if you are a developer that is trying to build multiple data centers, you are more likely than not getting right of control to multiple parcels of land in multiple states. And because of the degree of resistance that is occurring to the siting of these data centers, the interconnection request typically precedes the approval of the project. So it is possible and has occurred frequently that data center developers only intend to build one center, but they have 5 interconnection requests out because they're not sure where they're going to actually be able to get to build that data center. That duplicate projection of demand creates an artificially high perception of demand on the grid during the auction, which then drives up prices. When your utility bids for that capacity, they are paying that inflated price, and then you, as the ratepayer, have to absorb that price through your bill. And that's how the price increases trickle down to consumers individually. The general price for electrons goes up just by the prospect of development of a data center. So, some takeaways. I like to try to give people things that they can do, so that they feel affirmed and empowered after presentations, particularly ones that talk about challenges. So as far as conclusions and takeaways, I want you to remember that data center size is a major driving force in the considerations affecting price. Generating assets are reaching the end of their life at the same time as increased demand arrives. So this lower availability compounding with an increased demand is a really unfortunate perfect storm. And residential customers, because of their relative size, are super vulnerable to price swings and price shocks while still reliant on a central supply. So what can you do? We can always encourage our local governments to promote and increase renewable generation. We can invest in distributed generation. We can also encourage our utilities to continue to invest in capacity. This is both generating assets and transmission. There needs to be more duplication, particularly in the West. A lot of the Western infrastructure is so aged that it becomes an accelerant for wildfires. Upgrade existing transmission infrastructure. The transmission infrastructure that we have for a good portion of the country is older than 50 years. So they're reaching end of life at this point. And then, of course, the systemic piece is that improving and consolidating demand forecasting across ISOs and markets, the duplication issue should be addressed by some of the proposals that PJM put out over the last year. But PJM, while it's a market leader, is only one, and it still doesn't affect the issue of duplication across different independent system operators. So it's really important to make sure that the ISOs are doing a better job of talking to each other and making sure that the markets have the ability to account for this potential duplication in demand forecasting. So I hope I was able to give you guys some useful information. My email is in the slides if you have any questions and you want to follow up. And I think we have time for a few questions, Dr. DeJarnette.
We sure do have time for a few questions. Thank you so much, first of all. There's some reactions coming on the screen. We'll welcome others to share thanks. The reactions on the screen are in the chat. A few of you have added questions to the chat, and we'll dive in. I'm going to try my best to take these in order received, but I'm going to break that for the first one, just for a point of clarification from what you shared. You had a map that was the independent systems operators markets.
Yes.
And on this map, there's some white areas. Would you mind clarifying what the white areas are on the map?
Yeah, they're just areas that aren't particularly covered by any of the independent system operators. They are sort of standalone. They may be owned, like a lot of Alabama is covered by Alabama Power, which owns its own generating assets. So you get they don't have to go through any of the ISOs. They can still buy in the market, and the white spaces still have the ability to transmit power between states. They're just not covered by an ISO.
Hey, thank you for that helpful clarification. So there's a comment from Sarah Lynn, and this occurred actually before your talk began, but I think you may have a response to this. And it was about the CNBC story that was shared before, and she shared that we have to listen carefully to ensure the cost of power or electricity are not lumped in with the cost of natural gas, unless the data center in question is using natural gas fueled backup generators. Do you have any response or thoughts to add there?
Yeah, so I am also an environmental person. So I am trying to restrict myself or my comments to the issues around energy, but it would be irresponsible for me not to at least not say the important thing to remember about the emergency generators that are being associated with these facilities are not only consuming huge amounts of fossil fuels, they are also polluting nearly unrestrictedly. So when we talk about energy consumption of the data centers, it is also affecting the market for the purchase of natural gas and petroleum. Like they are large consumers and running a turbine or several turbines 24/7. It uses a lot of fuel. So it will affect that market as well. I've sort of limited this to conversations about electricity, but they also, by using turbines or generators, they're impacting diesel prices, they're impacting natural gas prices.
All right, you've given us much to think about, and I think we're going to just add to it through a few more questions. So let's see. So actually, I think this is also very specific to some of the maps that you were sharing as well. So this question is from Callie. There are no capacity auctions in, and I may say these wrong, ERCOT or
That's for Texas
CASIO,
one.
correct? Yes. Um, and so
And
you,
CAISO.
yes,
So,
yes.
so I am less familiar with CAISO than I am with ERCOT. Capacity auctions are more of a function of PJM, Mid-Continent, and Western Power. I think New York and New England also do capacity auctions. The thing about capacity auctions is that they sort of create order around the supply contracts. It basically says, listen, everybody, here is the capacity. Everybody has an opportunity to bid on portions or blocks of the capacity, as opposed to relying on a bilateral contract between a power plant and an energy supplier. So there are challenges with the auction system, but it is a lot more transparent than the bilateral system where everybody has individual supply contracts.
All right, thank you. Okay, we're going to try to plow through multiple questions, I should say. Thank you all for adding questions, and you're welcome to continue adding questions here in the chat. Roberto has a question about when creating regulations regarding data center development, would it be better to create regulatory tiers based on square footage or expected power consumption?
So I've seen approaches that do both.
Hmm.
And I think the things that you want to keep in mind is that we are dealing with sort of a second stage of evolution in data centers. Like the first batch of data centers, particularly the ones that were concentrated in Northern Virginia, were relatively small. I mean, they were more about facilitating data storage. They were about facilitating internet browsing. I mean, that's actually the largest portion of Amazon's business portfolio is AWS. It was less about harnessing the compute power than it is now. So we're dealing with a different iteration of data centers than we have previously, and the size is going to be different. Um, I personally, and this is not like clearly authoritative. This is just from my experience and my familiarity with technology to the degree that I am. Um, your methodology in regulating data centers has to be tied to power consumption because power consumption and not even just power consumption, but the relative power efficiency. I would also add in, as long as we're talking about regulation, you also want to regulate their emissions and you want to regulate their water use efficiency. But being able to regulate them based off their relative efficiency for power consumption is a more flexible and durable system because it will scale up as these sensors attempt to get larger. But trying to go based off square footage, that's more reminiscent of a model that regulated emissions or regulated the size of a factory. But keep in mind, like computing or processors get smaller over time. The amount of electricity that's able to be pushed through them and the efficiency of that electricity is probably the best way to be able to keep pace with increased size and increased efficiency of technology.
Oh, this has all been so fascinating so far. You've taken a really complex topic and made it digestible and understandable to many. So here's your next question, and this is from Amanda. How might a municipal-owned utility be more or less able to respond to demands and challenges from large customers like data centers? And what can residents, and PSCs do proactively?
Okay. So one of the things we're working on here at Consumer Fed, and we expect to have more information about this over time, is to basically create an opportunity for jurisdictions to have something that they can look to for creating separate rate classes for data centers. One of the things I didn't really get to dive in on is that utilities don't bill every type of customer the same. If you are an industrial customer, if you are a commercial customer, if you're a residential customer, depending on your jurisdiction, you can pay more or less than other categories. So I'm in the District of Columbia. Our office buildings actually subsidize our residential buildings. Our office buildings pay a higher rate than residential customers. But there are some jurisdictions where that's flipped, where they are specifically using the utility rate to subsidize a way to attract businesses. And commercial businesses will pay a lower rate than residential. I think the best way for jurisdictions to handle this, consistent with the environmental demands, consistent with the desire of their voters, consistent with the people who should be making these decisions, is to separate out data centers as a separate rate class. They're not really an office building. They're not really industrial. And there's no way you can think that they're commercial or consumers. Um, so being able to have that differentiation, and then your local public service commission can make a decision about whether or not they actually want to attract and subsidize data centers, and then they can give them a rate that reflects that. But if you are a community that has no desire to have a data center, then you can have your public service commission set a rate that makes it unattractive for them to be there. A public owned utility just kind of takes away the profit motive out of what the middleman utility gets out of selling electricity. A municipal owned utility is allowed to charge, it's allowed to charge cost of delivery plus a slight percentage over, but private or investor owned utilities are able to charge cost to deliver plus a reasonable rate of return. And that reasonable rate of return can vary really wildly depending on economic conditions or what your state legislature or local legislature considers reasonable.
Very interesting. And you got a response from Amanda here in the chat. In Louisville, I think commercial and industrial customers negotiate lower rates than residential customers. So we are already subsidizing industry. Very interesting. Thank you for what you've shared here. I'm going to try to squeeze in another question. So you mentioned earlier about other systems using batteries as a buffer source. Can you explain how this works on such a large scale, and is it better or worse for the overall system? And that question comes from Gary.
Okay. Scandinavia in particular is really good about this. So if you look at Sweden, Norway, the countries on that peninsula, they're really good at large scale industrial storage. There are several ways you can do this, and it would be an entirely separate like half-hour lecture to talk about the types of storage in detail, but there's a couple of ways that have actually worked historically and are proven in the United States. You can actually use hydroelectric as a storage. There's issues around creating dams and flooding areas. However, if you can create a dam in an area that doesn't cause environmental catastrophe, being able to have excess capacity on the grid at any given time, you pump the water up to the actual dam, and then when you're low on power, you release the water through the dam. It turns the hydroelectric turbines and generates electricity during times when you're not generating it. For green power, this is hugely important because there are times when the sun's not out. There are times when there's no wind. And in order to be able to store this energy, you need some mechanism. There's a bunch of technologies that have been developed and are in use and are proven technologies. And when I say proven, I mean like they've been working for 20 plus years. So it's not an issue of like experiments, but there are plenty of technologies that can be deployed in order to store the electricity over a long period of time, like several weeks, months at a time, in order to make sure that we have excess capacity on the grid so that we don't find ourselves in a day when there's like no sunlight and suddenly we're wholly reliant on solar and there's no sun. So being able to generate electricity and store it is a huge, it's a need, like it's an actual evolutionary need for us as a technology. We have to get to the point where we can store energy at an industrial scale in order to be able to move further away from fossil fuel based or carbon based energy forms. And it's just something that we haven't invested in as a country because, again, for a very long time, energy was very, very cheap here. We're entering a new phase where the demand is going to be a lot higher and we aren't going to be able to build fast enough to meet that demand. So we're going to have to make very different decisions about the way we've generated, stored, and used energy in this country over the next 5 years.
Oh, all right. That is a more factoids to keep in mind as we try to carefully assess the situation. I'm going to try to squeeze in a question to you that's like a four-part question, and then I want to be respectful of your time and respectful of the those that are staying on the line just a little bit extra, but just to lump things up because you've covered almost all of the questions we've received so far. I'm going to lump that in with the question for global examples, or lump your last response in for the question that is asking for global examples, and just pull together these two. So how does on-site power generation at data centers factor into what you've shared? And then that's from Jennifer, and then also blending in this question from Angeli. The modernization of the power grid sounds daunting based on your presentation. What are your thoughts on developments of microgrids and where are they feasible?
Okay. Ooh, that's a lot. All right. So I'll start with the microgrids because I actually think they're a little easier.
Okay.
A few years ago, Bloomberg's Cities Initiative had a very strong component for developing distributed generation and microgrids in cities. And it's important to keep in mind that like the center of the country, just because it's sparsely populated doesn't make it any less important. But the vast majority of our country lives within 100 miles of a city. So when we're talking about microgrids, what a microgrid is, for those who don't know, is a microgrid is it can be an apartment building is a great example. You can actually have an apartment building that is entirely self-sufficient if it has the ability to generate its own power, or if it is really efficient at recycling the use of its power. Microgrids are small contained areas that allow power to flow in and out of that small contained area, and if necessary, operate independently of the grid as a whole. So again, it works best in cities because the infrastructure is there, and you usually have the ability to tap into multiple power sources in order to make a microgrid work. But it's essentially a subsystem within the larger grid system. The idea is that as you make buildings more efficient, as you make appliances more efficient, as you increase rooftop solar efficiency, as you can create opportunities for more decentralized wind generation, you create buildings that essentially can fuel themselves. And the microgrid allows you to take that drain on capacity on the grid as a whole out of the equation. And then those electrons can be sent elsewhere. Because remember, The electrons are moving all throughout not just the city, but they're moving throughout regions, in some cases throughout the entire coast. So the idea is that microgrids will allow residents, increasingly residents, to have the ability to depend less on the grid and the connectivity to the grid, and honestly, the price volatility associated with the grid as a whole as these additional large drains on the grid emerge.
Wow. Much appreciated. There is so much that you have shared. I know several of us are probably thinking, we've got to watch this a second time to get even more. So I'm just thinking back through some of the highlights. I would say nearly everything that you shared personally for me was new knowledge. So thank you for the new knowledge that you have shared with so many of us today. We are so grateful for the expertise that you've poured into this. It was fascinating to understand the amount of power that's lost. It was so thoughtful of you to use LG&E as an example. So many of us that are here in Kentucky, or specifically here in the Louisville area, saw a bill that looked very much like the bill that we received. So much appreciated, and breaking that bill down for us, helping us to understand that when we're paying for electricity, we may take for granted, and we think about our bill this year and last year and may not look much further into it, but we're not only paying for the amount of energy that we use, but how that energy comes to us and the cost that it takes for that energy to come to us. So helping us to understand the lay of the land when it comes to energy, and the cost of energy in our communities, helping us to understand the amount that a residential user uses compared to data center, because we've been talking about these megawatts and kilowatts, and helping us to understand the difference there, and really compare and contrast. You've taken such complex information and helped to make that make a lot more sense to us. So those that are still here, sharing is caring. We would love for you to share the link on this. We'll share the link to the recording this afternoon once we're able to get it uploaded. But Karim, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to share just a few slides to close things out, and thank you so much to those who were able to stay over just a little bit extra. All right,
Thank you so
so
much. Thank you for having me.
we're so appreciative. Thank you so much, Kareem. So we want your feedback. We want to know how this webinar met your expectations. So you can use the QR code that's on the screen. You're also able to use the link that's shown on the screen if you want to type it in. Dr. Joy Hart has kindly also put this link in the chat, so you're also welcome to just click from the chat. We hope this series has met your expectation. It's going to round out with our culminating film screening and panel discussion next week, and I'll share more about that in just a second. But I want you to know that your feedback will help us to end this series strong and give us additional topics to consider within the exchange. We absolutely would love your opinions on potential future topics. So please take a moment to complete this really short survey. So thank you again to Kareem Marshall for sharing your expertise and your time, and really helping us to understand a very complex topic. Thank you to the audience for your participation. Thank you to the Christina Lee Brown Environment Institute for hosting this, along with Greenheart Louisville and the University of Louisville Superfund Research Center, along with PSR for sponsoring. For our culminating event, please join us for the Data Centers 101 film screening and panel. And we are really pleased to share the exciting experts that are lined up for this panel, including Byron Gary of the Kentucky Resources Council, Alyssa Owen of Sierra Club, Donovan Taylor, resident historian, community advocate, and moderating the conversation will be our very own Dr. Ted Smith of the Christina Lee Brown Environment Institute, and one of the organizers of this webinar series. So if you're in the Louisville area, please register using the link or the QR code that you see here on the screen. But we know we have people that have participated in this series from Washington, D.C. to Nebraska to Washington State, California, and even the U.S. territories. So if you want to join remotely, we would love for you to participate remotely. The same link that you have been using for this weekly webinar series will be used for the event. We have updated the Zoom, and we'll make sure that you have that update, and we'll also keep you up to date via email. So whether you are joining virtually or in person, we very much hope to see you there. That is July 23rd at 6 p.m. Eastern. Thanks so much. And we want you to stay engaged by visiting us online at centers.louisville.edu/environ. You can also stay up to date on upcoming events by visiting our events webpage, and you can follow us on all the socials at U of L Environ. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your interest. Please share about this webinar series, and we'll get this link out to you all as soon as we can so that you'll share. Thank you. Thank you.